Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Grand strategy can be a vexing term in international relations. There are those who feel that it simply discusses strategy on a larger scale. There are those who feel that it should be able to be contained on a bumper sticker, like the famous strategy of containment that guided the United States through the Cold War. In Volume 2, Issue 1 of TNSR, we actually have 3 excellent articles. One that looks at disentangling grand strategy, the relationship between international relations theory and U.S. grand strategy. One entitled Sweeping the Conceptual Minefield by Rebecca Lissner, that tries to clear up some of the misapprehensions about what grand strategy is and what it isn't. And one by Frank Gavin, looking at the question of nuclear weapons in grand strategy. In this episode of Horns, though, we take a different approach to grand strategy. We get to listen in on a discussion from editors and authors in a new book from Oxford University Press called Rethinking American Grand Strategy. The volume is edited by Erica Borgwart, Christopher Nichols, and Andrew Preston. And the discussion is joined by 2 of the editors and 3 of the contributors. The discussion is especially interesting as it takes a very different approach to what grand strategy is and what it has meant in American power. The topics that are discussed range from race relations to questions of nuclear strategy with the Soviet Union, and range in time from Alexander Hamilton to Henry Kissinger. This is a fascinating discussion hosted at the University of Texas, Austin, featuring Chris Nichols, an editor from Oregon State University, Andrew Preston, an editor from Cambridge University, and contributors Adrian Lentz Smith from Duke University, Charlie Adel from the Wilson Center, and Will Inboden from the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin. The discussion is moderated by Professor Jeremy Sturry of the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in on this discussion.
I want to welcome everyone to our session. I am so excited for the session. I've been looking forward to it since last spring when this wonderful book came out. And then we all communicated by email, and it's so wonderful when friends and great scholars are so willing to be available for a discussion like this. So I'm really excited that we get to talk about this book hot off the presses. The book we're going to discuss today, I hope everyone has seen it, and you can see it behind Chris Nichols, strategically located there for you, along with Promise and Peril as well. Rethinking American Grand Strategy. I think we should all hold it up at the same time if we have it in front of us there. Will already had this up. There we go. We're all teachers. We know visual is really important. This is a really important new book that our guests have edited and published, which really takes a concept of grand strategy that's actually a very, very old and important concept in policymaking, in history, in international relations, in political science, and I think remakes the concept, applying it to our current world in traditional and non-traditional ways. And I hope our discussion today will help to elucidate some of the really innovative, important, and very relevant critical thinking that went into this project in many different areas. The book is edited by Elizabeth Borgwart, Chris Nichols, who's with us today, and Andrew Preston. And then our other guests each have very substantive and meaty chapters in the book. To save us a little bit of time, I'm not going to give long introductions. I'll just say a little bit about each of our guests. Chris Nichols, one of the editors, is the head of the Humanities Center and a professor at Oregon State University. Andrew Preston is a professor and fellow at Cambridge University. Adrian Lentz Smith is a professor at Duke University. Charlie Edel, is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a fellow at the USA Studies Center in Sydney, and a former policymaker, member of the policy planning staff, and a Council on Foreign Relations fellow. And Will Inboden, I think, is known to everyone here, other than being the friend I follow around the world when we can travel. Will is the executive director and founder of the Clements Center and a professor in the LBJ School, a distinguished fellow in the Strauss Center, and various other things. Former policymaker, member of the National Security Council and State Department policy planning staff as well. So to get us started, I think everyone is going to speak. We're going to ask the 2 editors who are with us to take about 5 minutes, and then the other 3 chapter authors to take maybe 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll get into a discussion. And I think, Andrew, you're going to go first and talk about the framework for the project, yes?
That's right. Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks to you and to Will for having us to this event. It's fantastic. Obviously, it's a cliche now, but it's worth saying still that I wish it could be in person. I wish we could all be not just gathered together, but I wish I could be in Texas to enjoy the food and the weather and to see friends and to hang out. But of course, that's not possible. But this is a great occasion. So thanks for bringing us here together. As Jeremy said, Chris and I want to give an overview of the book. I'll start by giving sort of the big framing, and I'll try and be as brief as possible. And what I'd like to do is take and explain the title, but to work backwards. So the title of the book is Rethinking American Grand Strategy. And I want to sort of break that down, but to work backwards and start with grand strategy, then move to American, then discuss rethinking, and then hand it over to Chris. So the first question, if we begin with grand strategy, is why grand strategy? Why study it? And I think that sort of question kind of answers itself, especially to an audience at a place like UT. It's an obviously important subject. It's an important way of thinking. It's an important way of looking at the world. And it's also become an extremely common and popular subject and topic and subject of inquiry. It's clearly important to the study of world affairs and to how power is projected globally. And so Liz, Chris, and I wanted to understand grand strategy better, understand what it means, how it's changed over time, how it can enhance our understanding of the world around us, and to build on exciting developments at places, obviously at Yale, where the flagship program for the study of grand strategy is, but also at places like Texas and Duke and elsewhere. So we just wanted to basically get into grand strategy more and dig into it a little bit more. So if we take the second part of the title, American, why American? And the glib answer is that's simply what Liz, Chris, and I study. And that's what we were going to be looking at. You could have a book on the grand strategy of China or the grand strategy of Brazil or of Russia or of Britain or France or all sorts of countries. But there's more to it than that. We're looking at the United States not simply because it's the country that Liz, Chris, and I happen to study, and that's where most of our contacts are, and that's where the people who we invited, that's the area that they specialize in as well. The United States is an ideal subject for grand strategy studies because it's a laboratory for the development and use of all kinds of power, hard and soft, for ideological power, economic power, military power, political, cultural power, basically any kind of power that you can think of. Not many countries tick all of those boxes, and no other country ticks them as high up on the list as the United States. In fact, I would say that the United States is the most powerful country in the world still on all of those categories. It would tick right at the top. So it's this amazing laboratory. Even if you disagree with my assessment of American power there, I think everyone can agree that it's very unusual for a country to sort of have all types of power, hard and soft. And so it's this ideal laboratory for examining grand strategy. And if you want a case study for the study of, or to dig deeper into grand strategy as we wanted to, especially a more capacious study, where you're going to take the idea of grand strategy and stretch it out, then the United States is it. And that's not necessarily a pro-American statement or an anti-American statement. You could love the United States, you could hate it. It is really, I think, the best country to study if you want to rethink grand strategy. And that brings me to the last part of the title, and that's rethinking. And this is the most important part. So Chris, Liz, and I are all well-versed in traditional military and diplomatic history, but we wanted to explore grand strategy in more complex ways. Strategy was originally defined by military affairs, and there are historians who say to this day, and who have written amazing books, who say, really, in order to understand grand strategy, in order to study it, you have to confine your study to the military realm. Grand strategy, the study of grand strategy is still first and foremost about military history and military affairs. And we thought that was maybe a little bit too limiting. But still, that's how strategy has always been studied. First in history, then in strategy and tactics, going all the way back to the ancients. And the study of grand strategy grew out of that study of strategy, that long-standing study of strategy. But we thought that there must be more to grand strategy than this. To strategy as well, for sure, and we can talk about the differences between strategy and grand strategy, but obviously to the notion of grand strategy, which by its very nature is more capacious than mere strategy. Grand strategy studies for most of the 20th century meant matters of war and diplomacy, still well into the 20th century, but things began to change, as we saw in American diplomatic history with the cultural turn, in American military history and other military history, in the emergence of the new military history or the study of war and society. Now, we weren't the first, of course, to think in this more capacious way about grand strategy. At Yale and elsewhere, people were already taking the concept of grand strategy and stretching it and making it more capacious. But we wanted to dig into that ourselves, and we wanted to collect a lot of that thinking and rethinking in one place. And that's one of the reasons, probably the most important reason for this book. Our point wasn't to reinvent grand strategy as it's traditionally known or to replace it, but as the title says, to rethink it. And that means integrating sort of more traditional studies of the military and diplomacy and politics in with newer approaches to grand strategy. So we've got chapters in this book that would have been considered grand strategy decades ago, along with other topics that are very new to the study of grand strategy and strike people as very novel and innovative. As we write in the introduction, inescapably strategy is and always has been an active statecraft, but it isn't only that. And as we also add elsewhere in the introduction, even when it is about statecraft, it isn't always about diplomatic negotiation or the deployment of troops. It must also include newer topics like public health, culture, human migration, race, religion, integrating the hard power with the soft and coming up with a broader, more capacious, more flexible notion of grand strategy. But I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Chris to talk more about the specifics of the book.
Great. Chris, you have the floor.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that, Andrew. Thanks so much, Jeremy and Will and the great team at the Clements Center and the History Department and the LBJ School and everyone for having us here. I echo the sentiment that I'd love to be together, but I'm glad we can do this remotely. So I'll quickly do three things in my talk to build on what Andrew just said. First, I'll zoom out a little bit to embellish what he noted about rethinking American grand strategy. Then I'll take a few brief examples that I think are illustrative from the book that give us some sense of the kinds of contributions, our aspirations, and hopefully our achievements, and then say something briefly about one of my own chapters in the book. So first off, just to continue the line of logic that Andrew was talking about, when we define grand strategy and as we try to rethink it, one of the ways that we talk about that in the introduction was to mention that some theories of grand strategy are too limiting. And so we borrow from a concept called strategic culture to think a bit about the cultural embeddedness of all grand strategies and grand strategists. Now that seems pretty obvious, but it isn't necessarily clear in other ways of thinking about this subject. So, some chapters in the book recast central figures. There's a great chapter by David Greenberg that talks about one of the iconic grand strategists in U.S. foreign policy history, George Kennan, but doesn't look at him in terms so much of his articulation of the containment doctrine or his long telegram, but rather looks at some of his assumptions, his misanthropy, his racism, and exposes how those ideas at play in this individual then had real impacts in the kinds of strategies that he developed. Now, this wouldn't shock people studying grand strategy from other perspectives, but when you line this up in lots of different ways, one of the things that you find in the history that we've helped to construct is hidden grand strategists and hidden strategies abounding in the historical record. I think that's one of the really fun and important contributions of the project, and it's one of the ways that we wanted to push the boundaries of previous scholarship here. So to put it in a different way, the way that Liz, Andrew, and I define this, and Andrew and I put this in the introduction, a theory that bears little resemblance to the reality around us every day, in which gender, race, the environment, public health, and a wide range of cultural, social, political, and economic issues are not only salient, but urgently pressing, can only be so useful. We really need to take those issues into consideration as scholars studying this, but also, I would argue, as citizens thinking about grand strategy, engaged members of a community, and practitioners. And so we've also aspired for folks who are trying to expand their thinking about grand strategy in diplomatic circles to consider these topics and themes as well. So one example of this in the book itself is the second chapter by Beverly Gage, who's now the director of the Grand Strategy program at Yale. And she talks about the blob and the mob. And in particular, she expands thinking here on this subject to the grand strategy of social movements, not a traditional area of study, again, more in the realm of soft power, but something that should be relevant and understandable to all of us living in this era. For instance, thinking about 2020 and 2021 and how a so-called leaderless movement like Black Lives Matter could wind up not just having a real impact in the US, but around the world. Right. So social movements clearly can have large scale aspirations and impacts. But what's more, by looking at Saul Alinsky, the veteran radical movement theorist who sometimes has been referred to as the father of community organizing, Alinsky, late in his life, published a book, Rules for Radicals, 1971 or so. And the very first sentence, the very beginning, draws on Machiavelli and argues that Alinsky's orientation, what Alinsky was seeking in Rules for Radicals, it's written for, as he put it, the have-nots on how to take it away. And that Machiavelli was written for the haves on how to hold power. So right there, quite literally, you see a social movement strategist borrowing from the kind of iconic texts and thinking that you see in grand strategy programs and from grand strategists like Kennan, for instance, but adapting and co-opting that kind of language and those strategies for their own ends, for his own ends, right? So that's a really good example of the kind of way that you can rethink grand strategy to include different kinds of groups, different lenses of analysis. Another that I think is really pertinent for us today, Andrew slightly presaged this, is global public health. When we first gathered to think about this book project in 2014 and 2015, and when we gathered at Oregon State to have a conference that led to this book, Betsy Bradley, who then was directing the Yale Grand Strategy Program and now is president of Vassar, who's a public health scholar, encouraged us all to think about public health capaciously as a grand strategy. And her contribution to the book with Lauren Taylor is about the PEPFAR program of George W. Bush, AIDS relief to Africa, and thinking about that as a kind of template in some ways and problematic lessons learned kind of example in others of what a global public health grand strategy could mean and what some of the limitations are for that. And Betsy and I recently wrote an op-ed on this, which argued that if you look at the long history of the US's global public health activities, the US has a pretty modest record there. And in fact, has not been a leading voice in multilateralism for public health because of America's own kind of parochial orientations to going it alone, you might say. And so examples of this, I could expound on this in our conversation. After World War I, the US not only doesn't join the League of Nations, but doesn't act in the League's health organization. After World War II, when the World Health Organization is founded in 1948, the US literally doesn't have a seat at the table because Congress has put reservations on the US being constrained in health operations and other activities. It takes a Soviet diplomat to get the US a seat at the table, the World Health Organization. So these are helpful not just in thinking about the history, but in thinking about a path forward on global public health. All right, finally, just the briefest bit on my own chapter. I wrote about Woodrow Wilson and about W.B. Du Bois, an internationalist in the interwar period. If you know anything about U.S. foreign relations history, as this audience undoubtedly does, Woodrow Wilson looms large, like a colossus over it, as George Herring used to say. And yet, Woodrow Wilson factors very modestly in grand strategy literature. Why? This has perplexed me for a long time. One answer is because those studying grand strategy have often sought to study what along the lines that Hal Brands in the first chapter of the book talks about, a core fallacy of grand strategy studies. Studies of Wilson have often foundered on the shoals of thinking that he was unsuccessful, that his ideas didn't have impacts because the US didn't join the League. Idealistic internationalism didn't hold sway over US foreign policy for very long, certainly not achieving his own ends, right? So this gets to the core question about grand strategy, which I hope our other panelists will bring up. One way of defining it, which comes from John Lewis Gaddis and Paul Kennedy, but goes all the way back to Basil Liddell Hart and others, is as matching necessarily limited means to aspirational long-term ends. Hal's observation in the first chapter of the book is that if you only suggest that those ends have to be successful, you limit your study needlessly of who and what might count as grand strategy. And that kind of narrowness is a real problem for practitioners, for citizens, and for scholars. I could go on this. I hope we'll tackle that question as we go.
Great. Thank you, Andrew and Chris, for giving us a really a wonderful summary of your introduction and a good framing for the entire discussion, as well as bringing in some of the examples. So I thought, Adrian, we'd go to you next. And Adrian's chapter, which is all the chapters are worth reading, but this is a particularly I think, thoughtful chapter, The Unbearable Whiteness of Grand Strategy. Adrienne?
Thanks, Jeremy. Hey, y'all. I'm sorry that we can't be following this discussion with tacos and a trip to Barton Springs, but sometimes the world produces different circumstances. So I have long been puzzled by the fact that some people think that they can talk about power in the United States without talking about race. As I wrote in my chapter, whose title I still love a lot, few things have remained more consistent across centuries of American history than state hostility to people of color. This actually seems to me a pretty commonsensical statement, but it seems less so to people who don't think about racialized power or who don't see whiteness itself as race and filled with sort of notions and ideologies. Having been trained as a Southern historian or a historian of the US South, I was really used to historical subjects who talked about white supremacy as a project of political economy, as well as a kind of way of thinking about framing and seeing the world. Men for whom the discourse of home protection was always about security for themselves as rulers, and was always also used as a cudgel to beat back Black political actors. So it was, and I would say, and the North's acquiescence in this, right, in this sort of project of white supremacy was an indicator that they saw this as normal and perhaps desirable. So it wasn't much of a leap for me to thinking about how discourses of security and discussions of security, particularly in an imperial or decolonizing age, were then wrapped up in similar discourses. To get at this for my chapter, I went to two people who I find profoundly interesting and for whom thinking through the American Security Project and thinking through the nature of racialized power was foremost. Carl Rowan, who was Black, the first Black head of the U.S. Information Agency, and Sam Greenlee, who a few years before had been one of the first African Americans hired into the U.S. Information Agency. Both of them had a way of thinking through this. They're very different people, which is also helpful to sort of sit them side by side. For Rowan, the U.S. couldn't legitimately extend power in the world without kind of getting through the conundrum and the contradiction of Jim Crow, right, or of its commitment to white supremacy. So the success of American Grand Strategy required settling the question of American racism, whereas for Greenlee, the extension of racialized power was the project itself. And so the US, on some level, was unsalvageable. So he didn't talk about reform. He wrote about revolution. I think contrasting them tells you a lot about what people thought was possible and about, even for folks who are wildly divergent, what their shared analyses were ultimately. To sort of bring it forward today, as the Secretary of State talks about domestic renewal, right, as the key to American foreign policy, and mentions things that might, to some people who, again, don't think about the way in which power is made and sort of placed on others, would seem neutral: infrastructure or climate or opportunity. You see that sort of figuring out the dilemmas of American racism, what Ebony magazine called in the 1960s the white problem in America, remains not just salient, but urgent.
That's great, Adrienne. And it's startling living in Texas to think that race could influence policy in any way. Absolutely startling, isn't it? So, Charlie, you're going to take us to your wonderful chapter on Federalist Grand Strategy. And maybe you're going to sing as well, the little Lin-Manuel Miranda.
I will not subject everyone here to that, but let's also be clear that Grand Strategy, a key element of it is adaptation. So we are all at home. My son was sent home from school today. There was like a COVID case at school. So if he busts through the door, we'll all adapt and roll with it as we go. But look, let me just say at the outset, Jeremy, thanks for hosting this. Will, thanks for hosting. Adrienne, it's good to see you. But especially thanks to the three editors for the invitation to be part of what was a really interesting project. So look, just to get right to it, from my perspective, Grand Strategy at its most basic is two things and two things only: concept and execution. That is, it requires both conceptualizing the large ends, your objectives, and then again, ensuring optimal use of the means, the resources that you have available to you. Given the very limited amount of time here, I thought I would focus only on the concept, and we can get to some of the other things maybe later during Q&A. So let me say that the argument that I want to present is pretty straightforward. There's an original conception of American grand strategy. It can be found in the Federalist Papers, that it sketches in many ways and shapes American statecraft for the first several decades of the Republic, that it's not perfect by any stretch, and that it's not always followed consistently, and that elements of it are still relevant today, which I hope we can actually begin to tease out during Q&A. So when we talk about early American grand strategy, it's a fair question to ask, how early is early? Are we starting in 1776? Are we starting in 1789? And for the purposes of my chapter, I'm just going to tell you, no, we're not doing either of those. The Declaration was simply an aspirational statement, and the Constitution itself was a blueprint for the architecture of the federal government. But it was the Federalist Papers that were the first articulation of what grand strategy would mean in context. And for those of you who only know this history through listening to Lin-Manuel Miranda, there is a little bit of the Federalist Papers in Hamilton, but it's like alluded to only for a second. So I'm going to give you a little bit more context. In response to the anti-Federalist essays, those who did not want there to be a constitution, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, right, not Aaron Burr according to the musical, but just those three, published 85 essays for New York newspapers making arguments in favor of the Constitution. They were bundled together into 2 volumes and it was called The Federalists. Now, for those of you who teach this, for those of you who remember this from grade school, almost everything we think about the Federalists is rooted in domestic politics. That's how we remember it. But if you begin to count the number of them that are devoted to issues of national security and foreign policy, 32 at least of the 85 exclusively deal with national security issues. It seems pretty relevant to me that this was one of the animating forces behind this. And so the Federalist Papers, I think, present in large part a negative vision. If you don't have a constitution, this little thing that we have will be ripped apart, right? That's the negative aim, prevent that from happening. However, they do go on to describe a positive vision, more in aspiration than in reality, which is a republican form of government. But in order to secure that, they needed strategies. So from my reading of the Federalist Papers, there are 5, and I just wanted to sketch them really briefly here. First, that the nation must unite into a much more strengthened federation, getting rid of individual sovereignty for greater collective security, wealth, and liberty. So unity. Second, the country needed to expand. It needed to get much bigger if it was going to be safe. First, all the way across to the borderline of the Mississippi, and then all the way out to the Pacific. I actually think there's a really good debate about just how far the founders envisioned America to extend. We can say at least to the Pacific, maybe to the Western Hemisphere, maybe beyond that too, but it's unclear. A third part here was that America, if it was going to get strong, had to be a commercial nation that was capable of influencing the rest of the world as much through the weight of its economy as through the power of its ideology. Fourth one, neutrality. Right? Don't get involved in the affairs of Europe. Sometimes lean towards France, sometimes lean towards Britain, but neutrality is going to be the coin of the realm. And then finally, the authors of the Federalist Papers promoted the growth of defense capabilities, of hard power that would allow the Republic to defend its trade, to defend its territory, and that elusive thing called honor. Specifically, and they are pretty specific during the Federalist Papers, this came in a call for an enlarged maritime presence and more generally in an expansive national security capability. Now, a couple of takeaways from this, 3, and then I'm done. First, none of these were pursued consistently. Although I do think that the concepts here, those 5 that I painted, all have a certain elasticity to them and therefore guided most of the subsequent evolution of American statecraft. Happy to kind of talk about the consistencies and the arguments about what actually viable trade policy would look like. Second, because as Andrew articulated, this is a book about rethinking grand strategy. Grand strategy conceived in this manner, I think should be understood as the integration of foreign policy and domestic developments. Politics and economy play as much a part in grand strategy as do diplomacy and military force. Moreover, evaluating grand strategy, is it successful or not, means that you have to look at both successes and failures, consistencies and inconsistencies, internal tensions, and some of those unintended consequences. And third and finally, with the exception of neutrality, which has, for the most part, gone the way of the dodo, although Chris might want to argue with that because he is an expert on thinking the concept in America, I would say that many of these concepts are still relevant in broad stroke. The importance of domestic unity, and I would say, too, that many of these concepts are important, relevant, and sometimes we can see how significant they are by their absence. And so if we think about the importance of domestic unity and cohesion, if we think about how almost every major political actor and policymaker has thought that there is generally safety to be found in expansion and confronting threats far away as opposed to closer to you. If we think about America as very much a commercial nation today, even if its trade policy is very much in flux. And then finally, strength, particularly of the maritime and naval variety, is dominating and driving many of the conversations here in Washington today. So I mentioned that in passing because I think that we could have, if we wanted to, a really interesting conversation about contemporary grand strategy, but that depends where everyone who's watching this wants to take this. So thanks very much. Over to you, Jeremy.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. And last but certainly not least, of course, Will, on Nixon and Kissinger, these discussions should always begin and end with Nixon and Kissinger, shouldn't they?
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. In my chapter and my brief comment summarizing actually follow nicely both from a comment Charlie made about grand strategy being both design and execution. He talked about the design. Mine talks about the execution, the implementation part, and then follows nicely, Jeremy, on your book on the impossible presidency. And it's this. So a lot of very good scholarship and thinking has been done on what are the main ideas behind a grand strategy, what are its goals, what is its analysis of the world situation or the particular strategic challenges you're facing. And it seems to me that much less work had been done on how does a president in particular actually implement a grand strategy. So you may come up with the best analysis of the world situation, the best ideas on how to advance American interests or values or whatever your goals are. But if you can't get your government to do what you want, then your strategy may sound good in theory, but not work in practice. And so I did a case study on the Nixon administration, especially the partnership with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Since again, a lot of very good work has been done by including some of the people here on the screen, especially Jeremy, on what their overall strategy was. But I wanted to look more, how did they try to get their government to do what they want? And I start with what I call the paradox of presidential power, which is this: the president of the United States, by most measures, is considered the most powerful man in the world, maybe eventually the most powerful woman in the world. But almost every American president of whatever party feels powerless to get his government to do what he wants. And this is a common lament, especially in the more, starting with the 20th century going forward, as you have the federal bureaucracy grow larger and America's role in the world grow more complex. And so I took a deeper look at how did Nixon and Kissinger try to solve this problem. So they arrived in office with arguably the most advanced or sophisticated thinking really of any American president of the 20th century, arriving in office with a grand strategic design of essentially rebalancing global power, reducing tensions with the Soviet Union while resisting any further Soviet advances, extricating the U.S. from the morass in Vietnam, looking for some ways to increase American influence in the Middle East, and especially, of course, pursuing the strategic opening with China, which Nixon had telegraphed, a couple years earlier, and Kissinger very much saved. Okay, so they've got these big ideas. How on earth do they get their government to do it? And so my chapter is a real focused study just on the 2 months of that presidential transition between Election Day in November of '68 and then Inauguration Day in January of '69. And what did these guys do to be able to hit the ground running? And in word, it came down to a massive, massive centralization of power. So the National Security Advisor position had been elevated in influence and importance going back to Kennedy, when you had Mac Bundy doing this. Again, Andrew Preston has written a great book on this. But even in the Kennedy and LBJ years, the National Security Advisor was essentially more or less equal with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. As part of a team of national security leaders. And Nixon and Kissinger take that a step further, where they make the National Security Advisor first among equals, and really just first, and marginalize the Pentagon and especially marginalize the State Department. And interestingly, they got some advice to do this from none other than Eisenhower himself, who had otherwise run a broader, more inclusive a national security system. But when Kissinger met with Eisenhower in right after the election, and Eisenhower was almost on his deathbed, his big advice was, don't let the State Department have too much influence. Don't let the State Department run these interagency meetings. You can't trust them. It's got to be run out of the White House. Of course, Nixon and Kissinger already were inclined to do this. And so practical steps that they took during that transition time in designing the system they were going to be doing were basic things like making sure that the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council staff ran all the meetings called interagency meetings that included people from the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department and other American departments and agencies. That may sound humdrum, but again, the power to convene and run a meeting and set the agenda is power to get things done. And previously, a lot of those meetings had been run by the State Department. Kissinger was also a big believer that knowledge is power. And so they set up a very, what you might call, asymmetric information flow, where essentially every memo produced in the Pentagon and the State Department or CIA at senior levels, a copy of it had to be sent over to the White House. That was Nixon's and Kissinger's order. But all the senior level memos produced in the White House weren't being sent back out to those other departments and agencies. And so they knew what State and the Pentagon were doing, but they ensured that the State and the Pentagon didn't really know what was going on at the White House. Some of this was just bureaucratic deviousness, but there was a strategy behind it. And this is their big principle was linkage. That they wanted to make sure that interests that the United States was pursuing in one part of the world, or deals we may be trying to pursue with the Soviets in one part of the world, were also conditioned on Soviet behavior in another part of the world. And the way the U.S. government bureaucracy was set up, with each office and regional directorate and bureau focusing only on its own interests, the bureaucracy was not going to be buying into a concept like linkage. And so there actually was a certain strategic design to this. And even very practically, but very symbolically, since in Washington, it's all about how big is your office and where is it, Kissinger moved the National Security Advisor office from the basement of the West Wing on up to the first floor, just down the hall from the Oval Office itself. So again, maybe it was just symbolic, but it certainly sent a message about the National Security Advisor is now, like I said, the first among equals. So that's what I explored, and we can talk during the discussion about whether it worked or not. But it was, like I said, a really interesting chance to look at that bigger question of how is a strategy actually implemented? How does a president get his government to do what he wants?
Fantastic. Thank you, Will. And thank you to all of our presenters. You've really given us a real taste of the book and a sense of the book's conceptual as well as its empirical oomph.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.